The year is 1978. Absolute rock legend and bombshell Debbie Harry is about to release her third studio album, Parallel Lines. Now, on this album, there is a track that starts off with the lyrics, "Once I had a love, and it was a gas, then turned out, had a heart of glass." Now, obviously, the Blondie singer was, of course, singing in metaphors, right? Like, she didn't actually mean that she had a heart of glass. The song lyrics were about fragility. They were about being easily hurt or being emotionally vulnerable to the point where, if wounded, you would feel breakable. Through this new wave dance rock, Debbie Harry was weaving a conceit wrapped in an unusual 7/4 time signature. But what if she actually meant it? What if she actually grew to believe that some part of her, or even all of her, was physically made of actual glass? Like, how wild would that be? And yet, throughout history, several people have genuinely believed that they were. And what's even crazier about this is that almost all of them were either royal or at least of noble birth. And so, welcome to another episode of Crowned, Gilded, and Screwed. My name is Cara May Adamo, and if you are new here, welcome. Basically, the format of the show is that we do a deep dive on either a royal person or a royal adjacent person, as I like to say, somebody who is born into basically the same level of privilege or attains that level of privilege pretty early on in life. And they lead a very charmed existence from the outside looking in. But for whatever reason, sometimes even because of that privilege, they are unlucky in some capacity. Today, however, we are going to be deviating from that format. Instead of doing a deep dive on like one single gilded, sad sap of a person, we are actually going to be discussing the glass delusion and how it has affected a number of people throughout history, most of whom happen to be royal. So, what's the glass delusion? Literally, it's when a person believes that one of their body parts or even their entire body is physically made of glass, like I said before. Now, this might sound kind of ridiculous, and yeah, it kind of is ridiculous, but it's actually kind of a spin-off series from previous similar delusions that happened before it. Like, for instance, pottery delusion, which was pretty much the same thing, except people believed that they were made of pottery and would also subsequently shatter on the floor. The one thing about pottery delusion, though, is that it wasn't specific to like the upper classes. Pretty much everybody throughout the different class systems had the possibility of having pottery delusion. Once the glass came to Europe in larger quantities, though, like around the 1300s, pottery delusion took a backseat. So basically, view glass delusion as the sequel. It's the originals for pottery delusion's Vampire Diaries. So why did the glass delusion only affect the elites, though, since pottery delusion didn't? Well, honestly, it's because glass was kind of a rich person thing. The most infamous story of this affliction came about in the mid-1300s, and at that point, most average Joes hadn't and probably wouldn't ever see glass. They just didn't have access to the stuff. So it's unlikely that you're going to believe that you're made of something when you barely even know what it is. So simply put, they just weren't around it. So for the most part, we only see glass delusion in royalty, or at least cases were the only ones that were noticed or recorded. Since doctors in the Middle Ages were pretty scarce, they pretty much only took the time to treat the mental illnesses and derailments of, the dude bros in charge, partly because they were in charge and also because, money. So who were these doctors, and how did they view glass delusion, and how did they treat it according to the health guidelines of the Middle Ages? So first, let's talk about medieval medicine in general, because it does inform how they interpreted things like the glass delusion. Now, to start off, they believed in a theory known as humorism, which took me about 400 different tries to pronounce correctly. Humorism was the belief that the body contained 4 fluids, or quote unquote humors, and each of these were capable of affecting various aspects of a person's health, including their temperament or mental health and stability. Because it was the Middle Ages and every doctor was a glorified crystals girl, these humors were connected to a bunch of seemingly unrelated cosmic shit. These dudes probably would have been super into like sound baths and like zodiac signs. But since they didn't really have access to tech and modern science, I guess we can give them a pass. Like, if it wasn't for them, we probably wouldn't be where we're at now. So sparkle on, broskies. So the first of these humors is yellow bile, which is about as charming and lovely as it sounds. Yellow bile is connected to choleric, it's connected to childhood, and also your gallbladder, and it's associated with summertime, as well as fire and the planet Mars. Generally speaking, it also is associated with all things that are hot and dry, so it's sort of the Sahara desert of, the humors. Next, we have blood, which is related to optimism, actually. It's also related to your heart, to springtime, to adolescence. It is associated with the planet Jupiter, and its element is air. It's also connected to hot and moist things. Moving on, we have phlegm. So again, charming. It is linked to your brain, to autumn, to maturity, and also to the moon. So like not a planet, but close enough, still celestial. Its element is water, and it covers all things cold and moist. And so that leaves the fourth humor, which is black bile. Black bile was linked to wintertime. It was also linked to your spleen, old age, and Earth. Not the planet Earth, but more like the dirt, like the element Earth. The black bile's celestial counterpart is actually Saturn, so the planet is Saturn. It's also linked to things that are cold and dry, and it is considered the cause of melancholy. Now, melancholy by definition is a sort of pensive sadness. It's similar to what we might diagnose as depression these days. In the Middle Ages, anyone with either depression or anxiety-related symptoms leading up to and including delusion was considered melancholic, and so black bile was largely to blame. Mental illnesses were also considered to be a sign of demonic possession because, fucking course they were. So naturally, the glass delusion is considered a part of melancholia and that black bile humor, as well as potentially demonic possession. So that's basically how, humoralism worked, and that's how the doctors and the clergy might interpret somebody with this affliction. So now that we've talked about what it is, let's talk about the people who actually had it, starting with history's most famous case, Charles VI of France. Now, Charles VI was born in 1368 in Paris. He is the son of Charles V, the king at the time. And by all accounts, he had a pretty normal childhood, but the kid did get kind of a early bout of unfortunate luck in that his dad died when he was pretty young. That would be hard enough on any kid, except because he was the prince and the heir apparent, it actually made him king at 11 years old. Now, because he's only 11, he wasn't actually in charge of shit. It was more of he would sit in the room and then other advisors would kind of command the kingdom and he would learn from them. It was basically like an apprenticeship to be the king. Now, who were these advisors? Well, they should have been his father's advisors because his father was pretty good at being a king. He had a pretty decent rule. Unfortunately, his father had some brothers and his brothers were dickheads. So the brothers muscled all of the advisors out and they took over. And so the quote unquote advisors that would be in the room were these very selfish ass brothers. So now we have these spiteful ass brothers that basically use their position as, the governing body to essentially drain the coffers. And little Charles kind of watched this and he was aware that it wasn't a very popular thing. So as soon as he turns 19, he ousts them, gets rid of their asses, he fucking fires them, and he takes his dad's head of government and he puts them in their place and is like, you did a good job last time. I don't necessarily love what my uncles are doing. Fuck them. You're in charge. Let's go. And for a little while, it's actually pretty great. He doesn't have a lot of really upsetting moments up until his early 20s. So between 19 and his like maybe 24, he marries Princess Isabel and they start having kids. So now he's a new dad, he's a new king, he's just ousted his uncles. Like life's a little stressful. He's got some stuff on his plate and he starts to kind of buckle under the pressure. I will be honest, like, I'm going to gloss over some of the things that happened in Charles's life because it would take 1,000 years. And I'm actually saving most of this for our deep dive on him because he is a candidate for his own episode. But just know that a number of traumatic events do end up happening to him that kind of start to mess with his brain. I personally think he probably had some level of post-traumatic stress. Either way, even if he didn't, he did contract what we believe might have been typhoid, and he suffered from several fevers that were very, very high and for extended periods of time. Like we're talking a good like week or two, sometimes more than that, of very, very disturbingly high fevers, during which he started to hallucinate. So now you have these doctors and they are using the four humors to sort of diagnose and figuring out what's going on with him. And now he's starting to hallucinate. So they're starting to think it's, the black bile, it's melancholia that he's starting to get because it was sort of just a blanket term for mental illness for the most part at that point. And eventually he does start to get better, but the lasting effects of these fevers seem to have really taken their toll. Even the Pope at the time of Charles's reign noted in his personal paperwork that he believed those fevers severely impacted the mental stability of Charles. It's really sad too, because Charles started out being called Charles the Beloved. I suspect that was probably because he was like an 11-year-old cute little kid when he became king. It was in the Middle Ages when everybody was Philip the Brave or something the something. He was Charles the Beloved up until his early to mid 20s. After his crazy fever and after he starts to have these hallucinations, Charles has moments where he's completely lucid and he's fine and he's able to conduct everything the way that he should. Then he would have moments that would last weeks and sometimes months of absolute fucking craziness. Like he would go off the deep end and he would not recognize people in his court. He would not recognize his own wife sometimes, even though she gave him 6 kids. He was suffering dramatically. He would see things that weren't there and he would come in and out of these mental episodes. And poor Isabel tried really hard to be like regent in his stead, but she wasn't very good at it. So the whole thing started to crumble. Eventually, Charles the Beloved became known as Charles the Mad. If any of you have seen our Anne Neville episode where we compare the Red Queen and Margaret of Anjou to Cersei Lannister, where there's that Game of Thrones and Alice in Wonderland tie-in. In this case, I kind of wonder if maybe he took Charles the Mad and turned him into the Mad King. I kind of see a correlation there. And I wouldn't really be surprised because the Middle Ages was kind of the right time period. Either way, Charles the Mad is now just descending further and further into his sicknesses, and they're lasting longer and longer. There is an incident that is recorded where he and his posse are riding through the woods somewhere, and some fucking dude just shows up and starts talking at him as he's riding with all of his buddies. And the dude starts to tell him, "You have a traitor in your midst. Be careful. Don't trust them. They're out to get you." And Charles, who's not mentally well, listens and turns around and thrashes out at his own guys because of this fucking dude. I've seen conflicting research on whether or not they died or not, but I know he definitely injured some of these guys. Eventually, they had to basically hold him down and subdue him and drag him off because he was so crazed because he believed that there was a Judas in his midst. But here's the thing, I'm not entirely sure if that guy actually existed, the dude who was talking to him, because I don't know, I kind of feel like the king had his friends with him and his guards with him. You'd think that maybe they would have taken care of it before, especially since the guy's saying these guys are going to turn on you. You would think they would, I don't know, take that guy out, but they didn't. So I wonder if that guy himself was a delusion. Either way, Charles suddenly didn't recognize his own men. It just something flipped in him and he went right back into his delusions. At that point, he starts to really, really change. And this is where he begins to develop the glass delusion. In Charles, his case, and the reason he's so famous for this is that, well, first of all, he was, the French king, and obviously that's going to have some hype, but it's because he's one of the only examples that I've found and that I think is in recorded history where not just one part of him was glass, he believed his entire body was made of glass. Like, top to bottom, everything about him he believed was made of glass. Out of nowhere. Like, he didn't think this beforehand. Again, he had like 6 kids. He obviously was intimate. But as soon as the glass illusion kicked in, he started to keep really far away from everybody. He didn't want anybody to touch him. He became so paranoid that, like, he had special clothes made for him that were reinforced with steel and iron rods, or, well, not steel, but iron rods. And they would, like, protect him. Like, he basically made himself a wearable bird cage where he was the parakeet. Like, he would walk around with, like, these clothes on these iron rods in the hopes that they would protect his fragile glass body. I question the logic there because I feel like, I don't know, feathers would probably have been a better choice if you're trying to keep something that's glass from breaking. But I don't know. I guess logic was already no longer at the party. And so he demanded that he may have these special clothes made, and he wore them all the time. He would sit in a dark room completely alone and not let anybody go near him and just sit very still for hours in his, like, cage thing that he wore. He was particularly worried about his ass, like a lot. Like, he talked about it because he felt, for whatever reason, that, like, the most fragile glass, I guess, was in his ass, and or was his ass, sorry, his ass was made of this fragile glass. He would strap pillows to his butt so that it was extra cushy and protected. And that's Charles. Charles never got better, unfortunately, and he lived the rest of his days believing 100% that he was made of glass. He is sometimes known as the Glass King. So he's been Charles the Beloved, Charles the Sixth, Charles the Mad King, and the Glass King. So that is Charles for the 1300s. He dies in about 1322. The glass delusion kind of takes a backseat up until about the 15 to 1600s. Now we're going to intro the anonymous nobleman, one of which may or may not have been Philip II of Spain. It's not clear. Allegedly, it was him, but that one's up for debate. Either way, basically, at the end of the 16th century to early 17th century, there were these 2 physicians. Now, these guys lived in different countries. So one lived in Spain, one lived in France. But since they treated their, like, respective royal families, they sort of traveled in, like, the same bougie-ass circles. And apparently they were actually friends. Now, the Spanish doctor was called in to treat someone one day. Again, maybe Philip II, maybe not. And this guy was kind of an odd case he'd never seen before. He was perfectly healthy and actually pretty social, except for one thing, like one teeny tiny little quirk. He wouldn't leave his bed because he thought he was a glass vase. Like a vase. Like a vase that you put flowers in. Thought he was a vase. He was absolutely convinced. And so while he did entertain his guests, he would only do so from, like, a straw bed, which is a choice and sort of a dumb one, because this particular doctor was having, like, none of this shit. After a couple of failed attempts at reasoning with Lord Vase over there, he'd had enough, and he lit the fucking straw on fire and noped out. He walked out the door and closed it behind him, with the vase guy still on the straw bed. Takes almost zero time. All of a sudden, they start hearing, like, these pounding on the door, and it's just bam, 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 bam. Let me out, please, I beg of you, blah, blah, blah. So the doctor waits, like, a quick sec, and then he opens the door, and he's like, well? And the guy's like, dude, you, like, almost lit me on fire. What the fuck? And the doctor's like, yeah, I get that, but how'd you let me know you wanted out? Was it knocking? Was it the knocking? Was it banging your fists against the door and knocking? And he's like, yeah. He's like, all right, so you're not made of glass, because wouldn't you have shattered since you knocked? And then the guy's like, oh yeah, good point. And supposedly, like, according to legend in history, that solved the problem. Or at least it solved the problem of him talking to the doctor about thinking he was a vase. I don't know. I don't know if you come back from thinking you're a vase like that quickly. Although, like, I've had a near-death situation in my life. It's pretty traumatizing. Do I know that it necessarily fixed other maladies of mine? Not necessarily, but the logical thread was there. I don't know. I kind of feel like delusions and logic don't really go hand in hand. And like if you're starting to have these delusions, the logical thread doesn't really exist as much for you, but maybe it was fixed. I certainly hope so, because that is traumatic shit. But, apparently it worked. Meanwhile, his buddy also treating this anonymous noble person. And in this guy's case, he believed that his ass was made of glass. And I guess these guys were, the physicians were friends for a reason, because he also gave 0 fucks, like 0 metric fucks, and was like, fine, you won't listen to me? Fuck this, I'm done. And he bent the guy, like this grown man, over his knee, and he spanked him repeatedly. And the dude was pissed about it. And he's like, yeah, I get that it stings, but you know what didn't happen? You didn't shatter. And supposedly, through yet another beautiful example of trauma as medicine, the guy apparently saw his point and was like, all right, fine, I'm not made of glass. Again, we don't really know if these people were cured. We just know that the doctors said they were cured and they had 0 bedside manner. So that is the story of the 2 anonymous noblemen in France and Spain that apparently had glass delusion almost at the same time. Also around that time, there was a French nobleman named Nicole Duplessis. He was a wealthy, high-born nobleman, and he was even related to Cardinal Richelieu. He was a cardinal at the time that had a ton of influence over the French throne. So this is a very high-born, very powerful family, and Plessis was in that space. He was another poor soul, unfortunately, who was particularly concerned about having a fragile little posterior. Like Chuck VI, he wore pillows on his butt, and he had specially made clothes that were designed to keep him from shattering. There is no record on whether or not he was spanked, but there's also no indication that he ever changed his tune or got better. So again, causation, who knows? Maybe a spanking would have helped. Far be it for me to kink shame. But yeah, so that would be Nicole Duplessis. That then brings us all the way up to about the 1800s. Now, in amongst this period, there were people who allegedly were put in asylums for glass delusion, but there weren't really good records at the time of them unless they were noblemen, and we more or less see like rumors about it. I will say that at the time, there were numerous works of fiction throughout the 1300s and on about glass delusion. So this wasn't something that was like a very heavily held secret. It's just something that kind of went away. The public certainly knew it existed. So much so that Miguel de Cervantes, the guy who wrote Don Quixote, actually wrote a book called The Glass Graduate. And in The Glass Graduate, you have his main character, which is Tomas. And Tomas wants to be a lawyer. He's a peasant, but he wants to be a lawyer. And unfortunately for Tomas, he is apparently irresistible because some crazy bitch sneaks him an aphrodisiac to get him to like be hot for her, basically. Unfortunately, it backfires because it doesn't work as an aphrodisiac. She gives him the wrong shit. And instead, he just starts having these delusions that he is made of glass. Again, this is a work of fiction by Cervantes. It is not a real story, but it certainly echoes all of the examples we've seen. He never does get better. He becomes a laughingstock. He ends up going to war and dying in battle because, the author of Don Quixote is not going to give him a happy ending. So just so we keep in mind, this is something that was like part of what you could consider their pop culture throughout the centuries as well. This is not something that was a heavily guarded secret. It was just, not as many peasants had it. I will say that as glass seemed to become more and more common, you do start to see signs of people, like I said, in asylums that may have had it that were not noble, but they're just not very notable, and so we don't know a lot about them. Now, this brings us, like I said, into the 1800s in Bavaria, where we have King Ludwig's daughter, Alexandra. Just to start off, know that old Ludwig I was kind of an ass, and among his many fatal flaws, including rampant misogyny was that he, like so many other jewel-adoring jackasses surrounded by yes men, couldn't keep it in his pants. He had many extramarital affairs. This led to huge scandals, especially his affair with his mistress Lola, who, by the way, when he first met her in public, asked if her tits were real, just to give you an idea of the kind of guy we're dealing with. Basically, he has all these crazy extramarital affairs. He causes all these scandals. He ends up abdicating from the throne. And in the throes of this, like, it affects his kids significantly, of which he has many. We will actually get into like a whole episode on his son, Ludwig II. But for now, let's look at his fifth daughter, Alexandra, who he already generally described as like unwell, especially mentally unwell. She was temperamental. She had a couple of issues psychologically. And while she was apparently very beautiful and in all of her portraits looked stunning and had many men seeking her hand in marriage, Ludwig would like kind of warn them like, hey, I get it and I love her, but like she cray. Like that's like he would basically cockblock his kid. At some point in 1840, while Ludwig is having all of his scandals and he leaves the throne and the family's going through all of this stress and all of this craziness, when Alexandra is about 23 years old, her parents look over and notice that she's like acting weird, but even for her, which apparently was already pretty weird. More specifically, they see her walking through doorways, but she's like pausing and kind of assessing, and she's sort of turning and walking sideways through the doors. And they're like, what the hell is this? What is she doing now? Just to be specific and not to be insensitive to various body types, for the record, Alexandra was a thin girl. She wasn't heavy set by any stretch. There was no reason for her to be kind of shifting through narrow corridors, but she suddenly was doing this despite the fact that she had plenty of room. And when they cornered her and they were like, hey, what the hell are you doing? She announced very matter-of-factly, for the first time in her life, that when she was a child, she had swallowed a grand piano made of glass. I don't know where she found a grand piano made of glass. I don't know where in her body a grand piano was fitting, but she believed that she swallowed a grand piano in childhood made of glass, and all of the sudden was very concerned that if she bumped against the door frames, that the glass piano would shatter and cut up her organs. And you could not convince her otherwise. Nobody knows where this came from. It was just something she came up with at 23, or maybe secretly believed the whole time and decided to be more proactive about it at 23. Either way, I do think it's very interesting that like King Charles VI got this issue around like 24 years old, and now she, 500 years later, having the exact situation happen to her at 23. And both are under like crazy amounts of stress. If you look back to your 20s, like they are kind of a shit show. But fortunately, I don't know about any of you, I did not ever believe that I swallowed a glass piano. The poor girl did. She was eventually sent to a nunnery, but she actually has a very positive story that spins out of this because Alexandra was brilliant. She ended up becoming an author. And you can look up a number of books and short stories that she wrote over the years. Like she was a professional published author throughout her whole life. She never got married, but she dedicated herself to her craft. And she's actually a really interesting character. I don't necessarily know if she fits for this channel, but I do have plans for another one where I think that she'd be just like the perfect candidate. So stay tuned for that coming up probably in the next year. Similar to this, by the way, we have Tchaikovsky. So Tchaikovsky, obviously brilliant composer, but he was a little neurotic. Allegedly, he might have had glass delusion. Some people say he did, some people say he didn't. So I'm going to include him in this, even though like that one's not verified. But he did have this weird paranoia that his head was going to fall off. Like he was worried his head would just right on off. So he would wear these crazy high collars to like, not to be fashionable, but to keep his head on his neck, which is so dark. And that poor little lamb was trying to conduct and keep his head straight the whole time. Eventually, he must have gotten over it because he would not have been the incredible composer that he was had he never been able to like move, I feel. Or at least he learned to live with it. I don't know. But yeah, Tchaikovsky for the longest time tried to conduct very stiffly because he was so afraid that like his head would just pop right off his neck. No idea where he got that from. It was something he suffered with. But he was also a genius and gave us the 1812 overture. So, we don't really see anything with the glass delusion popping up in any severe or at least famous way up until you get to the 1920s. For those of you that watched our Princess Alice of Greece and Denmark episode, you might recall that her husband, Prince Andrea, was tried for treason after the catastrophic Asia Minor campaign. Now, one of the artillery officers at the time was a man named, and bear with me, I'm going to try to do this properly, Georgios Hastianestis. Even though I am Greek, I cannot pronounce that worth a damn. So Georgios Hastianestis, let's call him Georgie, just because I need to simplify things for me. I don't mean to be disrespectful to the Greek community. I just personally will continue to butcher this name. So Georgie. So Georgie was an artillery officer. He's very experienced at what he did. But during the Asia Minor campaign, he was under a lot of stress, which seems to be a trigger. And this poor little lamb, out of nowhere, with no lead up, no signs of any problem before, poor Georgie becomes frozen in the battlefield, completely frozen. And he announces that his legs are made of glass and won't move. He genuinely believed it. It was a momentary bout of glass delusion. It's also, aside from those allegedly cured guys that got spanked and lit on fire, it is the only example I have seen where they for sure got out of it. Alexandra might have gotten out of it a little bit because she did move on with her life. But poor Georgie only had it for like a minute, and it was at like the worst possible fucking minute. Unfortunately, like I said, the Asia Minor campaign goes to shit. Everybody gets in trouble, and it culminates into what is known as the Trial of the Six. Prince Andrea is found guilty of treason, and so is Georgie. Unfortunately for Georgie, he did not have the connections that Prince Andrea did. Prince Andrea gets rescued by King George at the time as a show of solidarity for the crown, and he runs off and does a whole bunch of dumb shit. Honestly, watch the episode if you want to know more about Prince Andrea and his charming ways. But back to Georgie. Unfortunately, Georgie does not have his connections. He does end up being found guilty, and he is killed by fire and court-martialed. It's the only one that I've seen of glass delusion where like the dude was punished for it, although like the worst possible conceivable way to get glass delusion, and war is a tricky thing. So that was Georgie, and that is the end of the pretty well-known cases of glass delusion. It kind of falls off after that. There are a number of theories on why it doesn't occur anymore. It obviously wasn't super, super popular into the 20th century. Basically, to my knowledge, doesn't really exist now. In the 1960s and 70s, there were some psychiatrists that allegedly had a patient who had it briefly, but then they cured them. But that also could just be them hyping themselves up. I'm not really sure. They seem very vague about the circumstances, although that also could be doctor-patient, confidentiality. I don't really know, but we haven't had any verified cases in basically since the 1920s. Georgie's the last one that I could find. So yeah, those are insane situations where people have clung to this delusion for dear life, as most people with delusions do. Mental health is such a tricky thing because it's based on so many factors. It's based on your hereditary background. It's based on what's going on around you, like what kind of stress you're under. It's based on your actual physical health. There are so many factors that go into it, along with your learned experiences. Like if there's anything, I have mild PTSD from the near-death experience I described earlier on in the show, and I experienced it. It involved a river, and I was in a river last weekend, and I experienced it all over again because your brain creates these snapshots, and you do live them in different ways throughout your life. And you can get help for it, you can get therapy for it, but back then especially, that wasn't as common. And again, for most of these stories, it was back when they thought that mental illness meant demonic possession, so they probably weren't too keen on it, or at least not super helpful. I will also say that glass has sort of lost its luster. It's not considered a prized possession anymore. It's pretty commonplace. It's also not as fragile as it used to be. I mean, yeah, look, if I dropped this, it would break and I would be very sad. But, the hurricane windows next to me are nowhere near as fragile. And I think that there's something about like our interpretation of the sturdiness of glass that probably has helped a little bit. But I also think it's just advances in modern medicine, technology, and mental health. And also, people are running PR for royals now more than they ever did before. So I'm sure that, even if it did creep up, we probably wouldn't know about it right away. I can imagine the crown just hiding the shit out of that, like they do a lot of things. But yeah, that's the glass delusion. I really hope that you enjoyed the show. If you guys are interested in more unusual episodes like this one, like this was more of a compilation episode, we wanted to try it out and see how we liked it. Let me know if you like it. We can definitely do more of them. We have a couple on our list already. Also, if there are any famous figures that you would like to see covered that are privileged, look like they lead perfect gold-gilded lives, but it turns out that behind the scenes, their lives are absolutely just spiraling out of control for some reason, drop it in the comments. Let us know. We would love to hear from you, and we will cover as many of them as possible. If you are a fan of the show, please like and subscribe. We appreciate it. Again, comment. Let us know what you think. Let us know what you think of glass delusion. Do you think it's something that could creep up again? Do you think that there is a modern day version of that? What are we surrounded now? Like we had pottery, we had glass. In the past, people also had cork and lead delusions where they believed that they were light as cork or heavy as lead. What kinds of delusions do you think are based on our modern day surroundings? I personally think that a modern version of this could be the TikTok and Snapchat filter dysmorphia that is now creeping up, where people are so used to their filters that they disassociate with how they actually look. And some kids are even asking to have kids and adults, actually. And let's not blame the kids. The adults do this too, where they are actually having more plastic surgery than ever, specifically to look like some of the filters. And I look like this. I'm content looking like this, but I've played with those filters and they are lovely. But I can imagine growing up with filters all the time, and the normalization of those filters can probably fuck with your head. So I'm interested to know if you guys think that maybe that's the new glass delusion. I'd be interested to find out. So again, like and subscribe. Follow us on Facebook at Crown Gilded and Screwed. You can also find us on TikTok at Crown Gilded and Screwed. My personal TikTok is Karita May. You can find me on Facebook at Karamea Adamo, and we have our production company has an Instagram called Mayward Productions. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time.